Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring a topic that you all requested, and that's over-explaining, especially when it comes to autism.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, we actually got a ton of really interesting articles and blog posts, even some personal reflections, all about over-explaining. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, some of the titles we're looking at today are Adult Autism and Over-Explaining, a Trauma Response, The Burden of Over-Explaining. So, I think by the end of this deep dive, we should all have a much better understanding of why over-explaining is so common for people with autism. And hopefully, maybe we'll all gain some new insights into the potential causes, ways to manage it, and maybe just like a deeper appreciation for, the autistic experience.
I'm excited to dive in. These sources seem like they offer a lot of different perspectives on something that I think is often misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely. So to kick things off, how about we try to define what over-explaining really means, in the context of autism? Like, is it just being thorough, or is there more to it?
Yeah, it's definitely more than that. The sources we have, they describe it as this kind of like compulsive need to give way too much detail. And it's driven by this like deep fear of being misunderstood.
Okay, so it's not just about being clear. There's a deeper anxiety kind of fueling it.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. And I remember one of the articles, I think the Adult Autism and Over-Explaining
Yeah.
Trauma Response, one, it had this anecdote that really stuck with me. I think it was about an autistic person who was like meticulously describing a very specific shade of blue that they needed for like a project or something.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they went on for like, I don't know, it seemed like forever, just to make sure there was absolutely no way the other person could possibly misunderstand.
Yeah, that's such a clear example of how over-explaining can show up in real life. It's not really about the blue itself. It's more about like making absolutely sure everything's clear to avoid any kind of like, negative consequences or something.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to like control the whole situation, but with words.
Yeah.
Like language becomes a shield almost. And this kind of leads us to this whole idea of over-explaining as a trauma response.
Yeah.
I feel like that phrase comes up a lot in these sources.
Yeah, for sure. And it's actually super important to understand what that means. So a trauma response, it's basically how our brain tries to protect us from anything that seems threatening, especially if it reminds us of bad experiences from the past.
Okay, so it's not just like a personality quirk. It's more like a deeply ingrained way of coping.
Right. And for some autistic people, being misunderstood over and over again or being judged or even just dismissed, it can make them feel really vulnerable. So over-explaining then becomes this way to, manage that feeling, to like minimize the risk of being hurt again, emotionally or socially.
So it's not just a quirk. It's like a protective mechanism, a way to like deal with past trauma.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing this strategy, even though it makes sense, it probably has some downsides too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, while it might, give someone a sense of control for a bit, the sources we're looking at, they really highlight how it often comes with a pretty big cost.
Oh, interesting.
There's one article, The Burden of Over-Explaining, and it talks about how emotionally exhausting and anxiety-inducing it can be to constantly over-explain. Like the author talks about feeling this constant pressure to like justify everything they do or say, and how it leads to this feeling of never really being accepted for who they are.
Wow. That's it's really sad to think about, that feeling of not being accepted. But isn't it kind of ironic that over-explaining, which is meant to, prevent misunderstanding, can actually end up causing more misunderstanding?
It is, right. Like you're trying to be clear, but it can sometimes backfire.
Yeah.
And sometimes people who over-explain might come off as like defensive or like they're walking on eggshells or even aggressive. And that can it can make other people tune out or just be less receptive to what they're trying to say.
Yeah, so it's like this vicious cycle. You over-explain to avoid being misunderstood, but then it actually leads to more misunderstanding.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue.
So it sounds like we've got this this kind of double-edged sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over-explaining maybe comes from wanting to connect and be understood, but sometimes it can actually push people away. So I guess what I'm wondering is, for someone who struggles with over-explaining, what can they actually do? Is there anything in these sources that offers any helpful advice?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the sources we have, they actually talk about some pretty practical strategies for managing over-explaining. And one thing that keeps coming up is this idea of like self-awareness,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like in the article, Autistic Self-Awareness, they really stress how important it is to like recognize over-explaining as a potential trauma response instead of thinking of it as like some kind of personal failing. You know what I mean?
Right. So instead of beating yourself up about it, you try to understand why it's happening.
Exactly. And once you understand where it's coming from, you can start to like approach it with more compassion, and be less judgmental towards yourself.
Yeah, I think that shift from self-criticism to self-compassion is it's super important. But I'm also curious about the actual like techniques.
Hmm.
Do these sources get into like specific things you can do?
Oh yeah, definitely. One thing they talk about a lot is setting boundaries, like learning to say no to that urge to over-explain, even if it feels uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, setting those boundaries can be tough,
Yeah.
especially when when anxiety is involved. For me, what helps sometimes is to like pause before responding. In a situation where I feel like I'm going to over-explain.
Hmm.
Just take a few deep breaths and think, okay, like what's the absolute most important thing I need to say here?
Yeah.
Kind of helps me focus on being clear instead of trying to cover every single detail.
That's a great example of like finding a strategy that works for you. And the articles we have, they also talk about the importance of self-validation.
Mhm.
So instead of always needing someone else to like reassure you, you kind of learn to validate your own experiences and emotions.
Right. So you're not so reliant on external validation. You build up that inner confidence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this all ties into this broader theme of acceptance that runs through a lot of these sources. It's not about, trying to fix autism or like get rid of these behaviors altogether. It's about understanding and accepting them as part of, a different way of being in the world, a different way of experiencing things.
Yeah, it's like recognizing that there's no one right way to communicate. Like what might seem like too much information for one person could be absolutely essential for someone else to, feel safe and understood.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it was in the Adult Autism and Over-Explaining, a trauma response article. They said something like, let me see. By recognizing it as a potential trauma response, practicing self-compassion and self-validation and setting boundaries, we can break the cycle of over-explaining and learn to trust ourselves and our words.
I like that. It's like it's about honoring your own communication style, you know, while also recognizing that that not everyone's going to get it right away, and that's okay. It just takes patience and empathy from both sides.
Absolutely. Open communication and a willingness to like meet each other halfway. That's really important. Like if someone's over explaining, instead of getting impatient or dismissive, we can try to see it as them trying to connect with us, trying to make sure we understand.
Yeah, we can do things like ask clarifying questions,
Hmm.
acknowledge their effort to be clear, and just like create a space where they feel safe to communicate in their own way.
Right. I think a big takeaway here is to really, recognize the potential impact of trauma on autistic individuals, like how past experiences of being misunderstood or dismissed they can really shape how someone communicates, how they cope with things.
It's a good reminder to be mindful, of what someone might be carrying with them, and to like approach those interactions with more sensitivity. Really listen without judgment.
Exactly. And, while this deep dive has been all about over-explaining, it's important to remember that this is just one piece of the puzzle.
Mhm.
Autism is so diverse and people's experiences are going to be different. The sources we have, they remind us to avoid making generalizations and
Yeah.
to really appreciate the diversity within the autism spectrum.
Yeah, everyone's different, and what works for one person might not work for another. So it's
Yeah.
about respecting those differences and approaching each person as an individual.
Absolutely. It's
That's
about fostering a culture of acceptance and really celebrating neurodiversity
Mhm.
in all its forms.
It really strikes me that this whole conversation about over-explaining, it kind of points to a much bigger need for like greater understanding and acceptance of, neurodiversity in general. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of these sources, they really highlight how important it is to create those spaces where autistic people feel safe and respected and, truly understood. It's about recognizing that different brains just work in different ways and that, those differences aren't deficits. They're actually like valuable strengths.
Absolutely. But I'm kind of curious, how do we actually put these ideas into action? Like how can we build those more inclusive environments, not just for autistic people, but for anyone who communicates or, experiences the world differently than what's considered normal?
Well, I think it starts with education and raising awareness, Like we need to challenge those really deep-seated societal assumptions about what's considered normal communication. We need to like broaden our understanding of neurodiversity and build those environments where differences are celebrated, not just tolerated.
I love that. Like,
Yeah.
instead of trying to squeeze everyone into this like tiny box of acceptable behavior, we build a world that embraces, all the different ways people express themselves. That's the kind of world I want to live in.
Me too. And honestly, I think it's possible, if we're willing to put in the work. It means listening to autistic people, learning from their experiences, and advocating for their needs and perspectives.
It's about like shifting from judgment to curiosity, you know, and to empathy. Imagine if instead of getting frustrated or impatient when someone communicates differently, we just like took a second to try and understand their perspective, to see the world through their eyes. What kind of impact could that have?
That's a great question. I think that shift in perspective could totally transform our relationships, our communities, and even society as a whole.
It all comes back to connection, right? Like whether we over-explain or under-explain or somewhere in between, we all want to be seen and heard and understood. It's like this basic human need.
Yeah, absolutely. And these sources really remind us that connection, it's not just about words. It takes empathy and compassion and a willingness to embrace all the messiness and complexity of human communication.
So for everyone listening out there, here's a final thought to chew on. How can you take what we've talked about today and apply it to your own life? What small changes can you make to create more understanding and connection in your relationships and your interactions with others, whether you're autistic or not? These ideas of empathy and acceptance and celebrating neurodiversity, they can really make our relationships stronger and build a more inclusive world for everyone.
And remember, this deep dive, it's just scratched the surface of this topic. There's always more to learn, always more perspectives to consider. So keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep sending us those source submissions. We love hearing from you.
Yeah, we're always excited to dive in with you. Until next time, happy exploring, everyone.